Hi, Keith Irwood here from the Irwood Group. And I wanted to start off today by talking a little bit about disaster recovery, ITDR, and some of the stuff that I have seen over the last 20 years, especially increasing over the last several, 5, 6 years. And that is really around the lack of DR in general, especially around documentation in the enterprise organizations that I have seen. Most part, most organizations do have good documentation, but I have witnessed quite a few, to the shock and dismay of several IT directors, IT management, and even chief information officers, to the lack of DR documentation or having little to no plans within their organization. So I want to share with you some of the things I have seen and witnessed over the course of my career, helping organizations develop and create their IT DR plans. Starting with the most common I've seen, one of the things is that there lacks an ITDR policy or policy statement within the organization, and it's as silly as it seems. This starts from the top. It's a top-down thing, and if you don't have a serious ITDR policy, many people, surprisingly, in the organization, or unsurprisingly, will not take it serious. One of the next things that I tend to run across a variety of businesses, and this is across industries, it's not just any one industry, and I'm not picking on any one business, but one of the things that I tend to see quite often is a lack of standardization of the framework within the plans itself. People go off and they start documenting their plans as they think they should or however they see fit. And this tends to mean that some plans exist, but they are not equal or the same. There's no standardization or proper existing framework, so that if I look at one plan or another plan, they're completely different. Nothing's in the same place at the same time. And that actually creates additional problems, because if I have to say, hey, my IT department, they're not available to handle this situation, or they're working on a different application because they control many applications, or they oversee many systems or applications, and we have to pass these plans on to either someone else in the organization or hire a temporary IT generalist. The plans aren't the same, and people are looking all over the place within the plan for the proper information they need at the right time. So frameworks and standardization are important for your DR planning. Another thing that I tend to run across is lack of a standardized location for repository of the plans. So what we tend to see is an IT system group might have theirs in a personal folder, a shared folder. Some people store them within, create or store them within Jira, Confluence, SharePoint. Some people have them on Word documents, other people have them in Excel documents, some people have them in other different third-party organizations such as ServiceNow, or there might even be some business continuity or disaster recovery application that's being used, and some people have them there and others do not. Along with that, the use of disparate pieces of software or resources to create the plans, as I just mentioned, such as Word, Jira, Confluence, that also creates a little bit of a mess in the organization for where things are. You need to have all of these things standardized. If one IT team is using Jira and another is using Confluence, although they're by the same company, they're in different locations. Other people tend to store their plans in Word or on a drive, and it's kind of complicated to find all of everything where it is when it's needed. these days it's not really that surprising, but it does create its own set of problems, and that is, well, the vendor handles all of our DR, and that's all we know, and that's all we do. We call up the vendor and they do everything. Well, in some cases that may be true, but in most cases I have found that that is not really the end all and be all. You still have your internal networks, you still have your internal security certificates, and when these things become missing, or I call the vendor and hey, they're having a problem connecting with certain things, we tend to run into problems. Along with that, when you have the vendors doing mostly everything, your internal IT teams may be unaware of certain other things that are required in order to kick off the actual failover process. For instance, recently working with another group, it was, well, we just call the vendor. It's simple. We just make a couple of IP address changes and that's it. Well, during an exercise that was supposed to be only a certain length of time, that length of time then doubled. We had trouble finding the actual settings changes because they changed the IP address, but then ran into other problems such as outdated and expired security certificates. Internal security had changed certain settings that the team themselves were unaware of. None of these things were documented at the time, only to end up being lessons learned and then documented and had to be put into the new plans that were created. So even if you think that your vendors are handling everything, most likely they're not. You still have internal things that need to be documented properly. One additional thing that goes along with that is when we're going to have an exercise or we're going to do a planned failover, it's important to do pre-checks and have those things aligned. Quite often things are changed and they're not maintained properly, so you need to go into the system and do your pre-checks to make sure that when we do these changes for the actual failover exercise, that they're going to properly be executed and run smoothly. And the reason for the pre-checks that you want to do pre-exercise is to make sure all those settings and things are aligned with how they're supposed to be. And that leads me to proper updating and maintenance of the network settings. Typically what we see is, IT's very busy putting out a lot of fires on the fly. There's different errors or system changes that need to be made. And typically the failover site doesn't get these changes. It's usually looked at as, I'll get to it later. They're not necessarily documented, so then they go missed or overlooked because they're not maintained at the time. So it's important that these are either documented or actually updated. It's best to update them as they happen, but that is a fairly typical reason, and it's even a reason why most exercises tend to have some failures, is because certain settings are out of date. Another big one that tends to hit teams, and it can be fairly controversial because of how different things are looked at. So during an exercise, what happens is if the team does an exercise and they executed the exercise and everything actually goes well, so in their minds, hey, we did the exercise, everything went well, we recovered within our RTO or maximum allowable downtime or within our SLAs, and everything went great. I sent an email to my boss or supervisor and said, hey, we did the exercise, everything's great. Turns out during the year, there's an audit. None of this was actually documented. There's no screenshots. There's no documentation of log changes. The only actual reference to the exercise is a couple emails back and forth saying, hey, we did it. It worked great. Have a great day. The only problem with that is if an actual auditor comes in, that's not proper documentation, so they're going to fail, and that usually tends to have a lot of disagreements and misunderstandings. And Documenting the exercise will go a long way for everybody's benefit, especially during an audit, or you have to prove, like, if it's not documented, it basically just didn't happen, and that's how an auditor is going to look at that. And finally, I want to leave with two last things. The second to last one is something that we often see is a misalignment with vendor SLAs and the RTO that's needed within the enterprise. These things should be worked at. They're usually contractual agreements, but always look at and review your contracts. Typically, we also run into, hey, what's your RTO? I don't know. Whatever the SLA is. Well, what's the SLA? I don't know. So make sure you document all this. Make sure that you align to the vendor, and even incorporate the vendor into your exercises. Make sure that they can meet the SLAs that they're telling you that they can meet, and make sure it aligns to your recovery time objectives. Also, one other thing is that there's often a misalignment between IT and the business. This typically comes in gaps between business process owners calling out one recovery time objective while IT has their own internal recovery time objective, and very often, not in every case, but they often won't align, and things need to be done so that they can come together and align in the end, whether that's we can shorten the recovery time objective from an IT perspective, or we can implement manual workarounds as a business process owner. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So I'm actually going to do a blog post. It's much quicker to do a video on this, but I am going to do a much more detailed blog post, and I'll leave a link to that in the comments below when it's published. And in the meantime, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so that you get our updated videos. Have a great day.